There's a well-known story about Ian Bounds. A fellow minister once visited him, expecting to find a man buried in books, preparing sermons. Instead, he found him, on his knees. Hours passed, no rush, no distraction, just prayer. Later, when asked about his preparation, Bounds gave a response that has echoed through generations. God does not need great sermons. He needs men who can pray. That moment captures everything, not just who he was, but why his life still speaks today. Because in a world full of noise, activity, and endless distraction, Ian Bounds chose something different. He chose the secret place. He chose 4 a.m. He chose a life of prayer that would quietly shape history from behind the scenes. But why? What did he discover in those early hours that kept him coming back for over 40 years? And what can his hidden life teach us today about power, purpose, and true spiritual depth? Stay with me, because what you're about to hear may completely change how you see prayer forever. And before we dive in, make sure you like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who needs a deeper walk with God. Now, let's step into the untold story of Ian Bounds. There are men who preach about prayer, and then there are men whose lives become prayer. Edward McKendry Bounds, known to history simply as Ian Bounds, was not just another preacher, not just another voice echoing from pulpits across 19th century America. He was something far more unsettling, far more rare. He was a man who believed that prayer was not preparation for the work. Prayer was the work, and that belief would lead him into a discipline so intense, so consistent, that for over 40 years, he would rise at 4 a.m., long before the world stirred, long before the noise of life began to meet with God in the quiet. But why? Why would a man willingly embrace such a demanding rhythm for decades? What did he see in those early morning hours that others missed? To understand that, we must first understand the man himself. Ian Bounds was born in 1835 in Missouri, into a time when America was still forming its identity. The world he grew up in was marked by tension, political unrest, spiritual awakenings, and the looming shadow of war. From an early age, he showed signs of intensity, not just intelligence but depth, a kind of seriousness that made people pause. He studied law and became a practicing attorney while still quite young. By all standards, his life was set on a path of influence, stability, and success, but something disrupted that trajectory. Something deeper than ambition, deeper than career, a call. Not the kind that comes with noise or spectacle, but the kind that quietly unsettles your spirit until you can no longer ignore it. Bounds felt drawn not to courtrooms, but to God. And so, in a move that many would consider irrational, he left the legal profession and entered the ministry. But even then, something about him stood apart. Most ministers focused on sermons, some focused on church growth, others focused on public influence. Bounds focused on prayer, not casually, not occasionally, not as a routine obligation, but as an obsession. He became convinced of something that would define the rest of his life. The church is looking for better methods. God is looking for better men. And in his understanding, better men were not more talented, not more educated, not more charismatic, but men who knew how to pray, deeply, persistently, relentlessly. Then came the Civil War, a defining moment not just for a nation, but for Bounds himself. He served as a chaplain in the Confederate Army, ministering to soldiers in the harsh realities of war. These were not polished church environments. These were fields of suffering, fear, and death. And it was here, amid the cries of wounded men and the uncertainty of survival, that Bounds' theology of prayer was forged in fire. He saw something most people never see. When everything else is stripped away, when strength fails, when plans collapse, only prayer remains. There were no eloquent sermons in those trenches, no structured services, no comfortable pews, just desperate men, and a desperate need for God. And Bounds prayed. He prayed for the dying. He prayed for the fearful. He prayed for the broken. But more than that, he began to understand something profound. Prayer was not just a spiritual exercise. It was a lifeline. After the war, Bounds returned to pastoral ministry, but he was no longer the same man. The war had carved something into him, a conviction that refused to let him settle into shallow Christianity. He saw the church differently now. Where others saw activity, he saw emptiness. Where others saw success, he saw weakness. Where others saw programs, he saw a lack of power. And in his mind, the root problem was clear. There was not enough prayer, not real prayer, not the kind that costs something, not the kind that requires sacrifice, not the kind that changes a man from the inside out. So he made a decision that would shape the rest of his life. He would not just teach prayer, he would live it. And that decision began with a simple but radical commitment. He would meet God every morning at 4 a.m., not occasionally, not when convenient, not when he felt like it, but every single day. Before the sun rose, before distractions could take hold, before the world could make its demands, he chose the secret place. Now, understand this clearly, this was not about discipline alone. It wasn't about proving something. It wasn't about religious performance. It was about priority. Bounds believed that the early morning hours held something unique, a kind of stillness, a kind of clarity, a kind of openness, a time when the soul could speak freely and hear clearly. And so, while others slept, he prayed. While others prepared sermons, he prepared his heart. While others rushed into the day, he lingered in the presence of God. And over time, something began to happen. His prayers deepened, not just in length but in weight. He wasn't just saying words anymore. He was interceding, carrying burdens that were not his own, standing in the gap for people he would never meet, wrestling in the unseen realm for things that could not be explained. And slowly, quietly, his life began to produce something undeniable. Not fame, not applause, not popularity, but power. A kind of spiritual authority that could not be manufactured. A kind of presence that people could feel even if they couldn't explain it. And yet, here's the part that makes his story even more intriguing. He didn't seek recognition. In fact, most of his writings, the ones that would later impact millions, were published after his death. Which means, the man who would become one of the most influential voices on prayer lived most of his life in relative obscurity. No spotlight, no global platform, no viral moments, just a man waking up at 4 a.m. to pray day after day, year after year, decade after decade, 40 years. Let that sink in. 40 years of consistency, 40 years of sacrifice, 40 years of choosing the unseen over the visible. But the question still remains, what kept him going? What did he encounter in those early hours that made him return again and again? Because no one sustains that kind of discipline on willpower alone. There had to be something more, something deeper, something that made 4 a.m. feel less like a burden and more like an invitation. Asterisk, asterisk, and in the next section, we will step into that hidden world, the quiet, sacred space where E.M. Bounds met with God and uncover the untold stories of what really happened in those early morning encounters, and why they changed not just his life, but the lives of countless others who would never even meet him. There is something unsettling about a man who willingly wakes up at 4 a.m., not once, not for a season, but for 40 years. Because discipline can explain a week, determination can explain a month, even passion can sustain a year, but 40 years. That kind of consistency points to something deeper, something that cannot be seen from the outside. It points to encounter, because no man returns to the same place, at the same hour, for decades, unless he is meeting someone there. For E.M. Bounds, 4 a.m. was not just a time, it was a doorway, a threshold between two worlds, the visible and the unseen, while the rest of the world was still wrapped in sleep, while the noise of life had not yet begun. Bounds would rise quietly, often in darkness, and enter into what he called the secret place. No audience, no performance, no distractions, just him and God. And this is where many misunderstand his story. Asterisk, asterisk, people often imagine his prayer life as long, repetitive monologues, endless words, religious language filling the silence, but that wasn't it. Bounds' prayer life was not built on volume, it was built on depth. He believed that prayer was not about informing God of things God already knew. It was about alignment, a positioning of the heart, a surrender of the will, a deep, sometimes painful honesty before God. In those early hours, Bounds did not rush, he lingered, sometimes in silence, sometimes in scripture, sometimes in what could only be described as wrestling, because prayer, for him, was not always peaceful. It was often intense. He would take on burdens that were not his own, praying for individuals, churches, communities, even nations. And this is where things begin to get mysterious. There are accounts, quiet, often overlooked, of how Bounds seemed to carry a kind of spiritual awareness that went beyond ordinary understanding. He would pray about situations before they happened, intercede for people he had not yet met, speak into circumstances with a clarity that felt almost unsettling, not because he was trying to predict the future, but because he was listening. And in those early morning hours, the noise of the world was absent enough for him to hear. To really hear, he once wrote, prayer is not learned in a classroom, but in the closet. And his closet was not just a physical space. It was a pasture, a place where ego died, where ambition was stripped away, where even ministry itself was laid down. Because here's what made Bounds different. He didn't use prayer to support his ministry. He used his ministry to support his prayer life. Let that settle. Most people pray around their work. Bounds built his entire life around prayer, which meant those 4 a.m. hours were not optional, they were essential. But what actually happened during those times? What filled those long stretches of silence and seeking? To understand that, we need to look at the structure of his prayer life, not as a rigid formula, but as a flow. First, there was stillness. Bounds would begin by quieting himself, not just physically, but mentally, because he understood something many overlook. You cannot hear God clearly if your mind is still loud with yesterday. So he would wait, not rushing into requests, not filling the space with words, just being present. Then came scripture, but not in the way most people read. He didn't skim, he didn't rush. He would take a single passage and stay with it, turning it over in his mind, letting it sink deep into his spirit. And then he would begin to pray it, not as repetition, but as conversation. If the scripture spoke of faith, he would ask for faith. If it spoke of holiness, he would examine his own life. If it spoke of God's power, he would lean into it. It was interactive, alive. And then came what he described as burden bearing. This is where his prayers shifted from personal to intercessory. He would carry people before God, sometimes individuals he knew, sometimes entire congregations, sometimes situations far beyond his reach. And this is where his prayers became weighty, because intercession is costly. It requires empathy. It requires focus. It requires a willingness to feel what others are going through. And Bounds embraced that. He didn't avoid the weight, he stepped into it. There were moments, though rarely spoken of publicly, when his prayers would stretch 4 hours, not because he was trying to be impressive, but because he could not walk away, because something in him knew. This matters, that what was happening in that quiet room was affecting things far beyond it, and over time, these encounters began to shape him in ways that could not be hidden. People noticed, not necessarily his prayers, but the result of them. There was a gravity to his words, a clarity to his teaching, a conviction that cut deeper than rhetoric. It wasn't just what he said, it was where it came from. And yet despite all of this, Bounds remained remarkably hidden. He didn't advertise his prayer life. He didn't turn it into a spectacle. In fact, many of the most powerful aspects of his life were only discovered after he was gone. His journals, his writings, his quiet, consistent discipline. It was as if he understood something that many today have forgotten, that the most powerful spiritual work often happens unseen. But here's the question that still lingers. If those early morning hours were so powerful, if they shaped his life so profoundly, why don't more people do it? Why isn't this kind of prayer more common? Because here's the truth, one that Bounds himself would not avoid. It costs too much. It costs sleep. It costs comfort. It costs convenience. It demands consistency when you don't feel like it. It requires showing up when there's no immediate reward. And perhaps most challenging of all, it forces you to confront yourself, your distractions, your weaknesses, your inconsistencies, because in the silence, everything becomes clear. And not everyone is ready for that, but Bounds was. And that is why, while others preached about prayer, he became a living example of it. But something else was happening beneath the surface, something even deeper than discipline, deeper than consistency, because over time, his 4 a.m. encounters began to produce not just personal transformation, but spiritual authority, a kind of authority that could not be explained by education, or talent, or position. And in the next section, we will uncover how those hidden hours began to translate into visible impact, how a man who lived largely unseen became one of the most influential voices on prayer the world has ever known, and why his message still challenges us today. There is a difference between speaking about power and carrying it. E.M. Bounds did not chase influence. He did not build platforms. He did not engineer visibility. And yet, something about his life made people stop, not because of what he did publicly, but because of what he had cultivated privately, because eventually, what is built in secret begins to surface, and in Bounds' case, it surfaced as something many could not quite explain: spiritual authority, not loud, not theatrical, not performative, but undeniable. It showed up in his preaching first. Those who heard him speak often described something unusual, not just conviction. But wait, it wasn't just information being delivered. It felt like truth pressing in. There are accounts of people sitting under his messages and feeling deeply exposed, not by accusation, but by clarity, as if something beyond the words was reaching them. Because for Bounds, sermons were never the main event. They were the overflow. He once wrote, "The preacher who is weak in prayer is weak in the pulpit." And he lived that conviction with unsettling consistency. While others spent hours crafting messages, Bounds spent hours praying them through, which meant when he finally stood to speak, he wasn't trying to convince people. He was releasing something that had already been settled in the secret place, and people could feel the difference. But it didn't stop there. His influence began to extend beyond the pulpit, not through campaigns, not through strategy, but through presence. There are stories, quiet ones, often overlooked, of how Bounds would enter a room, and the atmosphere would shift, not dramatically, not in a way that drew attention to him, but subtly. Conversations would soften, hearts would open, people would become aware, as if something unseen had entered with him. And here's the remarkable part: he never tried to create that effect, because you cannot manufacture what he carried. It was the result of thousands of unseen hours, where his heart had been shaped, refined, and aligned. And that alignment produced something rare: consistency between the private and the public. There was no disconnect, no hidden contradictions, no double life. What he was at 4 a.m. was exactly who he was at noon. And in a world even then where many lived divided lives, that kind of integrity stood out. But perhaps the most powerful expression of his influence came not through speaking, but through writing. Interestingly, E.M. Bounds did not set out to become an author. In fact, most of his writings were not widely recognized during his lifetime. They were discovered, compiled, and published after his death. Think about that. The words that would go on to impact generations were written in obscurity, no audience, no applause, no immediate feedback, just a man writing what he had lived. And what he had lived was prayer. His books did not read like theory. They read like experience, because they were. When he wrote about persistence in prayer, it was not a concept, it was a lifestyle. When he wrote about the cost of intercession, it was not an idea, it was something he had carried for decades. And that's why his words still feel alive, even today. Readers often describe a sense of being challenged not just intellectually, but spiritually, as if the pages themselves carry a kind of urgency, a quiet but firm call. There is more depth, more intimacy, more power. but also more responsibility. Because Bounds did not present prayer as optional, he presented it as essential, and not in a gentle, comforting way, but in a way that confronted complacency. He saw something many preferred to ignore: that much of what passed for ministry lacked real spiritual power, not because people didn't care, but because they had replaced prayer with activity, programs instead of presence, effort instead of dependence, noise instead of depth. And Bounds refused to accept that. He believed deeply that without prayer, everything else was empty, that no amount of strategy could replace spiritual connection, that no level of talent could compensate for a lack of intimacy with God. And so, his life became a quiet protest, not through rebellion, but through example. He didn't argue loudly, he simply lived differently, and that difference spoke volumes. But here's where things become even more compelling, because as his influence grew subtly, quietly, so did the cost. Because carrying spiritual weight is not without consequence, there were seasons of isolation, moments when his commitment to prayer set him apart not just from the world, but even from other ministers, because not everyone understood him. Some saw his intensity as unnecessary. Others saw it as impractical. A few even saw it as excessive. After all, who wakes up at 4 a.m. every day for decades, who prioritizes unseen labor over visible success, who chooses depth when breadth seems more effective? Bounds did, and that choice came with tension, because the path he walked was not popular, it was not efficient, it was not easily replicable. It required a kind of surrender that most were not willing to embrace, and yet he remained steady, not because it was easy, but because he had seen something in those early hours, something that made everything else feel secondary. And that brings us to a critical realization: the power in his life was not accidental. It was the result of alignment, daily, consistent, costly alignment, with God's heart, with God's will, with God's presence. And over time, that alignment produced a life that could not be ignored, not because it was loud, but because it was real. But there is still one question left to answer, a deeper one, because while we can admire his discipline, while we can respect his consistency, we still haven't fully uncovered the driving force behind it all. What kept him going? What sustained him through the years, through the cost, through the misunderstanding? Because discipline alone doesn't last forever. There has to be something more, something that turns obligation into desire, something that transforms routine into relationship. And in the next section, we will uncover that hidden fuel, the inner fire that made E.M. Bounds return to the secret place again and again, and why, once you see it, you may never look at prayer the same way again. Discipline can start a journey, but it cannot sustain a lifetime. Not like this, not at 4 a.m., not for 40 years, because eventually, discipline gets tested, routine gets tiring, and even the strongest habits begin to crack under the weight of real life. So what kept E.M. Bounds going? What was the force behind the consistency? Because if we reduce his life to mere discipline, we miss the point entirely. Bounds was not driven by obligation. He was driven by hunger, a deep, unrelenting hunger for God, not for what God could give, not for ministry success, not for recognition, but for God himself. And that changes everything, because when prayer becomes a duty, it fades. But when prayer becomes a desire, it draws you back again and again. And for Bounds, those early morning hours were not a burden, they were an invitation into something most people only talk about: intimacy with God. But here's the part many overlook: that kind of intimacy is not automatic. It is cultivated, slowly, deliberately, through time, attention, and surrender. And Bounds understood that. He knew that you cannot rush relationship. You cannot microwave depth. You cannot shortcut presence. So he gave it time, every day, year after year, and in doing so, something began to grow within him. Not just discipline, not just consistency, but affection, a genuine love for being with God, a longing that pulled him out of bed not because he had to, but because he wanted to. And this is where his story becomes deeply personal, because this kind of hunger doesn't come from nowhere. It is often born in moments of revelation, moments where you see God not just as an idea, but as a reality, where faith shifts from belief to experience, and once that happens, everything changes. 4 bounds. Those early encounters were not empty. They were filled with a sense of presence that he could not ignore. Not always dramatic, not always emotional, but real, steady, consistent, deep, and over time, that presence became the anchor of his life. When things were uncertain, he returned to it. When ministry felt heavy, he returned to it. When the world felt noisy, he returned to it, because he had discovered something many never fully grasp, that the presence of God is not just a place you visit, it is a place you can live from. And that realization changes how you approach everything. It changes how you speak, how you think, how you respond. Because you are no longer operating from your own strength, you are drawing from something deeper, something steady, something unshakable. But here's the tension, because while this kind of intimacy is powerful, it is also costly, because the closer you draw, the more you see, and not just about God, about yourself, your motives, your inconsistencies, your hidden struggles. Because real prayer is not just about asking, it is about exposure, standing before God without filters, without excuses, without performance, and that can be uncomfortable, even painful. But Bounds didn't avoid it. He embraced it, because he understood that transformation only happens in truth, that growth requires honesty, that depth demands vulnerability. And so, in those early hours, he allowed himself to be shaped, corrected, refined, strengthened, not in public, but in private, and that private shaping became the foundation of his public life. But there's another layer to this story, because hunger alone is not enough, even desire needs direction, and Bounds had something else that fueled him: conviction, a deep, unshakable belief that prayer was not optional, that it was essential not just for him, but for anyone who desired real spiritual impact. He believed that without prayer, everything else was hollow. And he didn't just say that, he lived it, even when it was inconvenient, even when it was exhausting, even when it felt costly. Because conviction anchors you when emotions fluctuate. It holds you steady when motivation fades. And 4 Bounds, that conviction was clear. If prayer is the source, then it must be the priority, not secondary, not occasional, primary, non-negotiable. And so, he structured his life around it, not the other way around. But perhaps the most powerful aspect of his inner fire was this: he wasn't trying to impress God. He wasn't trying to earn anything. He was responding to something, a love that had already been extended to him, a grace that had already been given. And his prayer life became a response, a daily returning, a continual leaning in, not out of pressure, but out of relationship. And that is why it lasted. Because anything built on pressure eventually breaks, but what is built on love endures. 40 years, through changing seasons, through shifting circumstances, through the quiet, unnoticed passage of time, the fire remained, not because it was forced, but because it was fed, daily, consistently, in the secret place. But now, we arrive at the final and perhaps most important question. What does this mean for us? Because it's one thing to admire a life like this, it's another thing entirely to respond to it, to look at his story and ask, is this level of depth still possible today? Or was it reserved for another time, another generation, another kind of person? And in the final section, we will confront that question head-on, unpacking the lasting legacy of Bounds and the uncomfortable, powerful invitation his life still extends to anyone willing to listen. There are stories that inspire, and then there are stories that confront. The life of Bounds does both, because it's easy to admire a man who prayed at 4 a.m. for 40 years. It's easy to respect the discipline, to appreciate the consistency, to even feel motivated for a moment. But if we're honest, his life doesn't just inspire us, it challenges us, because it forces a question most people would rather avoid. If this kind of depth was possible for him, why not for us? And that's where the tension begins. because we live in a different world now. A faster world, a louder world, a more distracted world. Our mornings are filled with notifications. Our attention is constantly divided. Our time feels limited, stretched, fragmented. And so, when we hear about someone waking up at 4 a.m. to pray 4 hours, it feels unrealistic, almost extreme, maybe even unnecessary. But here's the truth we cannot ignore. The world may have changed, but the need for depth has not. If anything, it has increased. Asterisk, because the more noise there is, the more we need stillness. The more distractions we face, the more we need focus. The more shallow things become, the more valuable depth becomes. And this is where the legacy of E.M. Bounds becomes more than history. It becomes an invitation, not to copy his exact routine, not to force yourself into a rigid schedule, not to wake up at 4 a.m. just for the sake of it, but to reconsider something far more important: priority. Because at the core of his life was not a time, it was a decision to place God first, before work, before responsibility, before the demands of the day. And that decision is still available to anyone right now. But here's where we must be honest, because while the invitation is open, the course does not change. Depth still requires time, intimacy still requires attention, consistency still requires sacrifice. There is no shortcut, no hack, no quick fix, because real spiritual growth has always been, and will always be, slow, formed in hidden places, built over time, strengthened through repetition. And that is the part many struggle with. We want results, quickly. We want transformation, instantly. We want depth, without the process. But Bounds' life stands as a quiet contradiction to that mindset. It reminds us that the most powerful things are often the most unseen, that what happens in private shapes what is revealed in public. That a life rooted deeply will eventually bear fruit visibly. But here's the part that makes his story even more powerful. He never saw the full impact of his life, not in his lifetime. His books, now read across the world, were largely published after his death. His influence, now recognized globally, was mostly hidden while he was alive, which means he lived his entire life without needing to see the outcome, without needing validation, without needing recognition, without needing proof that it was working. And that kind of faith is rare, because it means trusting that what you do in secret matters, even when no one sees it, even when no one applauds it, even when it feels like nothing is changing. It means believing that God sees, and that is enough. And that might be the most powerful lesson of all, because in a world driven by visibility, Bounds chose faithfulness. In a culture obsessed with results, he chose consistency. In a time where recognition often defines value, he chose obedience. And because of that, his life still speaks, not loudly, not forcefully, but clearly. It whispers across generations. There is more than surface-level faith, more than occasional prayer, more than distracted devotion. There is a deeper place, a quieter place, a place where transformation happens slowly, but surely, and the door to that place is still open, but stepping into it requires a choice, a personal one, not influenced by trends, not driven by comparison, but rooted in desire, a decision to pause, to prioritize, to pursue something deeper. And maybe for you it doesn't start at 4 a.m. Maybe it starts with 10 minutes of intentional stillness, a moment of honest prayer, a decision to be present without distraction, because every deep life begins with a small step. But here's the key: consistency, because what you return to repeatedly will shape you, just like it shaped him, day by day, moment by moment, year after year, until one day you realize something has changed, not suddenly, not dramatically, but deeply. And that is the invitation E.M. Bounds leaves behind. Not a rule, not a pressure, but a path. A path that leads to something real, something steady, something that cannot be shaken by circumstances. And now, the question is no longer about him. It's about you. What will you do with the invitation? Will you admire it and move on? Or will you respond? because the same God he met at 4 a.m. is still available, still listening, still present, still inviting, and maybe, just maybe, your own story of depth, of transformation, of quiet, consistent pursuit is waiting to begin right now. So if this stirred something in you, don't ignore it, lean into it, start small, but start intentionally. And if you're ready to go deeper, to explore more stories like this stories that challenge, awaken, and transform, make sure you like, subscribe, and share this video, and drop a comment below. What is one step you're willing to take, starting today? Because sometimes the smallest decision becomes the beginning of the most powerful journey of your life.